Welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 87. An heir and a spare. Llywelyn ap Iorwerth sat atop the mountain, or at least the shadows of Snowdonia, having achieved most of his dreams. By 1216 he had worked to create a link into his neighbours, either by victories or convenient marriages to the Marcher lords and the princes of Wales. He continued to demonstrate his power on the field of battle and continued to appear unstoppable. John, King John, was now dead. His son Henry III was now king, but he was a child, and his advisors were not able to achieve the same dominance over Wales that earlier kings had done. Left to their own devices, the Marcher lords came up second and joined in Llywelyn's rebellion. They, for the most part, were making peace with him rather than fighting him. In 1218, following the end of the resistance of the barons of England, Llywelyn came to terms with the Peace of Worcester. He was allowed to retain all he took and held in both South Powys and areas around the south in Carmarthen and Cardigan. And in fact, he held in trust both castles and lands for the descendants of these areas who he was supposed to give them back to once they got of age. In the case of Carmarthen and Cardigan castles, they were actually the king's. He and his allies were forgiven by the church and brought back into the fold of God as they would see it. And in other words, Llywelyn was supreme. Now, of course, during this rebellion, he had been excommunicated by the Roman Catholic Church, so this is a big step in an era when the church had such dominance in the way of thinking and attitudes of people. This would have been an important piece of the puzzle. During the next 5 years, Llywelyn solidified his eastern border by marrying his daughter Helen to the nephew of the Earl of Chester, Ranulph. This particular fellow was known by the name of John the Scot. He was an important piece to the protection of the eastern half of Gwyneth's kingdom. With them on side and that area kind of covered, it kept them from being a problem, and they would be allies to Llywelyn for a very long time. And however, even if he'd healed one side, he would have issues with the Earl of Pembroke. William Marshal II, unlike his northern neighbor, was not a fan of this particular king and his ideas for power, and he stood against him typically. Disagreements in 1220 saw Llywelyn invade the southwest, burning castles in Narberth and in Wyston, and the town of Haverfordwest suffered from him as well. He ended up basically being bought off at times. Obviously, Llywelyn did not try to keep these areas. Rather, he was just pillaging them, and eventually was able to be bought off by Pembroke, who sent him £100 to go away, effectively. Marshal was then left wanting as he appealed to the king, but with the king in his minority and the advisors not really interested, it fell on deaf ears. During 1223, Marshal actually invaded the northern half of South Wales and started to move up against Cardigan and Carmarthen to try and seize lands that were by right his at that point, at least in his mind. At this particular moment, he caught Llywelyn unawares because Llywelyn was busy in Shropshire, seizing the lands of Kinnerly and Whittington. But because of these invasions, he ended up losing Cardigan and Carmarthen to Marshal. Llywelyn sent his firstborn son, Griffith, to deal with the Earl, and mostly to keep him from making more gains to the north. Griffith was the bastard son. He was not the heir to the throne, at least according to Llywelyn. But he was an important part of his ability to fight back against the English and was used as a military leader and was well respected enough to be able to lead Llywelyn's southern battles. This becomes important, of course, because Griffith will also see himself within Welsh law to be the proper heir to the throne, and it will become a problem for everyone involved at that point. The English of the previous eras had been divided against Llywelyn. They hadn't been a united force. There had been Marcher lords that had fought for him. There was the Welsh lords that fought for him, and quite often the English king and his subjects weren't always on the same page and weren't really able to lead a charge against him, other than that one point when John almost took Gwynedd completely and forced Llywelyn into a bad negotiation. This time around, Marshall was able to gain more trust and gain more people to help him, and because of this, Llywelyn was in a lot more trouble. On October 8th, 1223, he lost a number of captured territories, but his allies in the south finally held their own lands, which they had lost to Marshall from the south. And that negotiation became important because this allowed Llywelyn to finally gain some peace, to avoid having to fight any more wars with the English, and particularly Marshall, who was apparently a thorn in his side. And until 1228, this seemed to create that moment where he was able to accomplish a lot of things. Specifically, Joan, his wife, who had been for many years his closest political ally in the fight with the English. She was a key person to make and negotiate treaties. She was a part of those that went to her father, King John, to try and negotiate a peace between her husband and him. She had been a critical help to him and became considered an important Lady of Wales, if we were to be honest. So for someone who was, born of Norman nobility, who had been intertwined with the Plantagenets, to be now suddenly a key figure in the Welsh ruling families and the Welsh structure is an interesting dynamic in and of itself. But I think it is interesting to look at that and look at her contributions. She definitely was a very strong-minded and very well-beloved lady. And so much so that we know that Llywelyn forgave her a lot of things that he might not have forgiven others. And we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. But the other thing is she seems to have been very clever, very much an equal to her husband, and certainly an equal to her brother, Henry, and to her father, enough so that she could make peace deals. She negotiated with them. She appealed to them. She was quite often used as sort of the go-between. And because of that, I think she has a significant portion of why this kingdom was so successful and why Gwynedd was able to survive for so long. Her achievements cannot be fully described because, of course, we don't get that portion of history. We don't get a really great understanding of the things she did and didn't do. But I would say that it's recognizable that she had a lot of influence and that she continued to be an assistant and a negotiating partner. And because of this, I think this led to her receiving notifications from her erstwhile brother, or stepbrother in this case, as Henry, acknowledged that she was a legal heir to the throne, that she, or at least a legal descendant rather than a bastard. And so she achieved that, which I think in a way, this legitimizing of her legacy made it easier for Llywelyn to go back to Henry and try and get favor for his son, the legally and legitimately born son David, who he had decided was the heir to his throne. He had fully made that decision by this point. And so one of the things that he did was he spoke to Henry and tried to convince his government that David should be recognized as the heir to Gwynedd and not Griffith, who, to be fair to Griffith, under Welsh law, that would not go and that would not be acceptable. Quite typically, as we've seen with Welsh law, everybody inherits and then it becomes who survives that fight. It becomes very Games of Thrones, if you wanted to argue from that perspective. Things get a little chaotic as soon as that all comes about. And we'll talk some more in depth about all of this. But nonetheless, it's an important point for them. And that need for her to be recognized and for David to be recognized is incredibly important. And as we said, they needed to have the English primogenitor, or, the knowledge that the firstborn son legitimately should inherit, because that would make it easier for him to argue things under English law, if not necessarily under Welsh law. If the king recognizes David, it would also set Gwynedd up as the prime Welsh kingdom. It would stop the eventual factionalization of various groups behind different sons and keep strong the Welsh predominance that Llywelyn had built in Gwynedd over other native rulers and a few of the Marcher lords. It was a tall order, which was fraught with a number of dangers, not least of which because the English monarchy desired to keep the Welsh divided and malleable, and the idea of trying to gain authority over them in this way would be something of a concern for the English, because for them, having the Welsh divided, fighting, being able to pick the sides they wanted to pick, becomes incredibly important to them, because that keeps the Welsh from being able to do what the Scottish and the Irish were able to do, which is unite against them, and specifically with the Scottish to ally themselves with other countries and start to push back and become a thorn in the side of their governments. And that was a big part of why I think the English spent a lot of time trying to keep the Welsh from uniting and picking away at their territory, because legitimately it would keep them out of that ability and keep them from being able to unite under one ruler and argue that they needed to be independent, which again is something the English did definitely not want. By 1229, Henry had accepted the homage of David, acknowledging his primogeniture and his inheritance, which I think was a key item and an important one. In 1230, Llywelyn was able to arrange the marriage between David and Isabella de Bruys, the daughter of William, who was the son of Reginald, an important member and a significant person in the Marcher lords, and set yet another relationship. And you can see that what Llywelyn is doing with interrelated relationship buildings through marriage and through marriage alliances, he's creating not only protection for himself, which he did in the past, but he's also setting the stage for his son to try and protect him from the obvious problems that will come about once Llywelyn is dead. Llywelyn's seen this story before. I mean, we've talked about this quite often in Welsh history. The leader of the Welsh, at the time when the Welsh are in their brief moments united, runs into trouble on the minute he passes away, because his sons aren't considered the legitimate heirs of his kingdom. They aren't necessarily even one son that can be picked apart as the actual heir. And largely what this leads to is then fractionalization, factionalization, and then divisions even amongst within the kingdoms and the cantrefs over who should be the heir, who should be the legitimate king, and basically we have killing sprees that then go on. And as we mentioned before, that all goes to the advantage of the English, and certainly not something that the Welsh need or want. However, things would start to become problematic for Llywelyn. Around the time that we have Llywelyn trying to work with Henry, though, we find other issues coming up. In fact, with Griffith, his problems with Griffith grow. Griffith, of course, had been made a war leader, somebody important to the throne in the way he would lead armies, but all of a sudden now, as of 1228, he was a liability, not a help. So it was in this point that Llywelyn imprisoned him, and he remained there until 1234, so almost 6 years effectively in prison. And mostly it appears that this was done to keep Griffith out of the way, out of sight, out of mind, and to help David receive the English recognition, and so that Griffith couldn't assemble people to fight against this. Likely that was a large part of it. And by the end of that, this I mean, let's be honest, this in all likelihood created more problems for Llywelyn than he probably thought and bargained for. It created issues for him because Griffith is going to have supporters, especially as a war leader. You'd think he'd have armies, or at least some soldiers that would be on his side, and certainly some of the nobility in Wales would be on his side. So already you've got that problem, and it's hard to say whether or not this played into the issue of why he was imprisoned as long as he was, but certainly it appears like it was done specifically to kind of tuck him away while they tried to negotiate with Henry to get David recognized, to allow that whole thing to begin appropriately, and acknowledging really that Griffith has as much right to the throne as David does under Welsh law. Unfortunately for Llywelyn, things didn't work out exactly the way he'd hoped. In a divisive battle with a few of the Marcher lords, he ended up capturing William de Brossay, his erstwhile brother-in-law to his son, and held him captive for some months. And during this time, this is when Llywelyn used that imprisonment to hold him hostage to try and get Isabella given to David. So in a way, I guess that was the point. But in the consequence of that, there were problems, because Llywelyn would discover William in a highly, as quoted by Carrie Mond, she says that he found William in a highly compromising set of circumstances with Joanna, his queen. And because of that, Joanna was banished from court for a time. But more importantly, on May 2nd, 1230, William was hanged for adultery. And that kind of thing shows that there was obviously problems with Joan, that this young man, because I'd have to assume he was young, had built a relationship with her that was deemed inappropriate by Llywelyn. But even after that, you can tell that while the relationship fractured at that point, it wasn't completely broken between Joan and Llywelyn. Eventually, she gets back into his, I mean, I hate to say good graces, but that's kind of what it was. By 1231, she was restored to her position and restored in favor with the court. And this was about the time when, again, Llywelyn is trying to deal with some of the Marcher lords, specifically Herbert de Biru, and trying to stop their ambitions and capture some more of their territory in the Brecon area and Radnor. So, again, this is trying to deal with stuff in Glamorgan, in Caerleon, in Neath, in Kidwelly, a number of other places, trying to effectively push forward his agenda, which is to become the king of all of Wales, and eventually enforce and push that the English actually recognize him as such and recognize his heir as such, which I think is an important point for Llywelyn at this stage. Llywelyn at this stage is 10 years away, 9 years away, depending on what year we're talking about, from his own passing away. So he's trying desperately to create a legacy that's unbroken and one that was acknowledged by the English. And as we all know from later history, that doesn't ever happen. But the reality is that Llywelyn can see the writing on the wall, and he knows he has to get this done. And he knows that the English tendency is to help and encourage a breaking of that. So you can tell that he spent a lot of time trying to deal with that and trying to sort that out. And in fact, throughout most of 1238, Llywelyn's envoys were in negotiation with Henry III. And mostly because Llywelyn was trying to capture a title which he considered to be important, a title that would signify his ruling over Wales pretty much as a whole, but certainly the native parts of Wales. And that title was the Prince of Aberfawr and the Lord of Snowdon, which would then go to David. And it was something that Henry was not fond of, and it would be perceived as a fairly significant act. And realistically, it would set something up that the English did not want. So they never allowed for that, didn't want that to be handed down to David. And even though the attempts were made to try and make it more secure and setting aside all the Welsh lords, trying to get them on board with recognizing David as the king of Gwynedd, or in this case, the prince of what effectively would be Wales. There was never enough amongst even the allies that really acknowledged this as a reality and wanted this enough to put it in place. And it's a difficulty that he had right until the end of his life, as Llywelyn continued to try to push this. Meanwhile, however, Griffith was now in southern Powys and stirring up resentment, or at least working with others who resented the Gwynedd power plays and were trying to push his agenda over David's. And so at one point, Griffith was shunted out of southern Powys and then put into Llŷn Peninsula, basically given that as his cantref to control, and hopefully to, well, as the idea goes, is they were hoping to keep him from causing more trouble by limiting the amount of things he had access to. Obviously, the resources in Llŷn are much less than what's in Powys. You don't have the agricultural reach, and you don't have, the same type of ability to use things in a medieval era would have been important and useful. So at that point, that was one of the goals. And this, of course, led to Griffith responding much more violently in 1239 and in 1240. But eventually, David tricks him and then imprisons him in Crickeath Castle. So as Llywelyn is reaching the end of his life, in all likelihood has much less to do with what's going on in his kingdom. David and Griffith are already fighting over who will take charge of the kingdom. And of course, once again, Griffith is captured, Griffith is put into prison, and David is protected and set up to be the heir. However, on 11th of April, 1240, at Aberconwy, Llywelyn passes away. And with his death ends the first and probably last real good, solid opportunity that Wales had had for probably nearly 200 years to pull away from the English, to become their own kingdom in full, and really to set up the descendancy so that there isn't this constant push and pull towards the various heirs, and to kind of anglicize Welsh law so that this wasn't the same old. I mean, the old ideas and the old ways of the Welsh descendancy, where everybody gets a piece and then they fight over the scraps, is something they didn't want, and was something that was seen as actually causing trouble and causing problems for the Welsh. And so this was a desire to try and put an end to that in a way that would be finalized without having to go through a murder spree every time somebody passed away. So for Wales, it's an important step, and unfortunately it's one that they never really get to, because of course we're not far away from the end of independence at this stage. We're going to talk a little bit more about the court of Llywelyn next week, but thank you all for listening. Thank you all for being a part of this podcast, and I appreciate it, and I appreciate your comments, your questions, your concerns. You can always reach me at welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com if you have any questions. You can always reach me on Twitter at welshhistorypod, and on Facebook, of course, facebook.com/welshhistorypodcast will take you to our page. And I hope you all have a great day. Take care. Goodbye.
This has been a Distractions Media production, and for everything we do, check out distractionsmedia.com.
This is Peter.
And this is Tom.
We want to tell you guys a little bit about our podcast. Tom and I met in college, became best friends, and then teachers almost 20 years ago. Sometimes school just does not allow us to elaborate on the topics that we find interesting, like the real shark attacks that inspired the movie Jaws, or the real historical context to Indiana Jones artifacts. Where does cereal come from? Or are zombies real? Does Ben Franklin really deserve to be on a $100 bill? On our podcast, just like in our class, there are no stupid questions.
Just two friends having a lighthearted conversation about history, pop culture, and the context of current events.
Listen to History Teachers Talking Podcast from Evergreen Network, anywhere you get your podcasts.